The news had been covering the murders seemingly non-stop over the past 18 months, and Diana was getting sick of it. While she was definitely sympathetic to the tragedies that befell the Quads, she always felt they bore some of the responsibility of their fates. As a strong Christian woman, she believed that godly living was imperative to survival in a godless world. She felt emphatically that her Christian values are what kept her and her family safe. Her daughter was away at school and it scared her a little bit. She was a great girl who focused on her schoolwork and would never be in a position to be killed by a psychopath, she hoped. It gave her a sick comfort when she heard about what the girls were going before they were killed. As long as she could keep her daughter away from that lifestyle, she would be fine. She fit the description of the other girls in every other way. From the sound of things, all of the victims had been out partying, drinking, and most likely fornicating. She believed it was these actions that put them in a position to be victims in the first place. Thus, they were partly responsible for their own deaths. If they'd stayed home, studying and living godly lives, they'd still be alive. However, despite her beliefs, the way in which a woman died was horrific to her, and she hated when the news began describing the state of the victims. She switched the channel, landing on yet another headlining news coverage of the latest gruesome homicide. This death was the 10th in the 18-month span. 20-year-old Gia Murty was found in the back of a frat house in Austin, positioned behind a dumpster. This homicide bore fruit for all the newscasters who had begun speculating about the potential of a serial killer. DNA didn't believe that at first, but now it made sense. All the women were Caucasian with brown or black hair and in their early 20s. None of them appeared vaginally or anally penetrated for sex, but with a hard metal object to cauterize the parts pre-mortem. Their bodies were left staged, both breasts removed, and a cross carved into their chest plate. She shivered when she heard it and knew her position of fault was cruel. Because of that, she never spoke about it to Frank. She switched the channel again, this time to an episode of My 600-Pound Life. One of her guilty players, she loved to watch the way others people live, but truthfully, deep down inside, she would sit and pass judgment at their physical limitations despite her being 18 pounds over the recommended weights for her diminutive frame. But in comparison, she was healthy and that made her feel good. Is watching that news story, honey? Frank spoke up from his recliner to her right. He was so quiet, she had forgotten he was there. Oh, sorry, Frank. I want to hear about them girls being killed by some psychopath. Some of them remind me of Becca. He sat up quicker than she had expected, but his tone was still soft and slow. Now, how you know he crazy? Looked like Herodin, the word a dirty whore. His tone was matter of fact, which sent a shiver down Diana's spine. Frank, she was agreeing with him deep down, but too much of a Christian to admit it. What, Diana, you know, you see, thinking? It too, he spat with his slow southern drawl. She looked at her husband, his red portly face wrapped in a sandpaper beard of snow and tufts of hair bursting from just about his ears. The top of his head glistened from the overhead light, the moisture of contribution of his own battle with obesity. He was once a handsome, strapping, athletic man who worked with his hand and always provided for her and the kids. He had really let himself go since then, but Diana still thought he was handsome in that all that kind of way. Since Rebecca left for school, though, he had begun taking better care of his appearance and had become more romantic. He was happier lately, so she wasn't going to push him too much. Well, I mean, guess if they wasn't drinking or not drugging. They had their faculties to be safe on and off the campus like our little Becca is. She smiled and he returned the smile. Knew you'd understand, he said directly. She smiled again, not knowing what it was that she'd understood, but she loved when Frank agreed with her and was in a good mood, so she took the compliment. She switched the TV back to the news station. That was just wrapping up the explanation of the mutilated body. She looked over at Frank, who was staring at the TV with the same vigor as he used to do with her when they were young kids. His hungry eyes used to wrap her body cup, her breast, and practically do the job before they ever touched. Now he was looking at the TV like that as the newscaster described women who were torn to pieces like slabs of meat. She started for a minute. Frank felt her looking and adjusted a bit. pulling at his crotch to adjust the front. He tried to shift the awkwardness. Well, these little girls need to follow the good book instead of being fast out there in college. You talked back about this. Diana embraced the pivot. Yes, she ain't going out to Nona, them frat parties and that mess. She said, Mama, no, you know. I'm here for education, not fornication. Just like I taught her, Diana was a proud, peacocking mom at the moment. Yes, we did good. Diana, sure, Miss Pekka, though Frank stood up. Where are you going, Frank? Diana was enjoying their conversation. I'm up in my basement for a few. The head. Frank, what you be doing down there all that time lately? Nothing, woman. Maybe working on something for a year. But you can't say it just yet. He winked playfully. Diana blushed, and she had blushed in nearly 15 years, 20 because of Frank. 15 years ago, there was a hiccup in the marriage that left Diana close to another man. He made her blush and do a bunch of other things, but through the Lord's mercy, the marriage was able to be saved. I love it, Frank. Frank stood up, walked over to his wife, and kissed her on the almost wrinkled forehead. Love you, he whispered. You too, Frank. She held his hand for a minute. Frank walked out of the living room and into the kitchen toward the stairs. Diana flipped the TV back to my 600-pound life. She heard Frank moving things downstairs, but just turned the TV up. After about 20 minutes or so, Frank emerged from the basement. Off to work on Love You. The screen door slammed shut before Diana could reciprocate. She waited a few minutes, listening for Frank's car to sound like it had driven off into the distance. When she was satisfied at the muffle of the engine, she was on her small, pudgy feet. She was an impatient woman, evident even in her unwillingness to wait for Desert until after her meal. She could never wait for anything, and Frank knew it. She interpreted that his acknowledgement of the potential gift would only encourage her to score the basement. She approached the door, but there was a padlock on it. No worries though. She knew where Frank kept all of his extra keys. Frank knew that she knew where he kept everything. This only solidified her belief that he wanted her to find what was in the basement. She went to the front door and popped up a loose floorboard. She reached into the dark space and pulled out a large, janitorial-looking keychain. She stood up, fingering through them as she walked toward the basement door. She found a series of keys that looked like they could open the smaller bronze padlock. She tried the first and then the second with no luck. For some reason, she jumped to the fifth one and slid it in the lock. Perhaps because the shades of bronze was the most similar, the key turned and the steel mechanism released and shifted. The lock opened. Basements were rare in the South for a multitude of reasons, from conditions to necessity. Some include temperatures, ground freezing depth, and even soil composition. Still, Frank had insisted on paying the extra money when they had this home built about 15 years earlier, shortly following the Diana affairs. Frank told her that it gave them a fresh start. He was very selective in their location, making sure the soil could support a basement. He would say that it was for storage purposes, which was something that other Texans would never understand. Diana didn't question his logic much. In fact, she generally supported him and didn't have much of an argument since he forgave her infidelities. Thank you, Lord. Diana pulled off the lock, placing it on the counter to her right. She opened the door and was immediately hit with the stench of mildew, formaldehyde, and a faint perfumey smell, probably named something like love spell or sugar kisses. For a split second, the thought Frank might have brought her new perfume. She wasn't a fan of those young girl smells, but it was the thought that counted, and currently Frank had become increasingly thoughtful. She descended the stairs each one morning under the stress of her weight. The smell intensified as she walked into the dark basement. Looking at her right, she noticed the old surgical table she didn't remember owning with a dark brownish liquid stain running off the edges. Some of Frank's old tools littered the corner, his industrial blowtorch perched near his old iron fireplace rod that had burnt. Animal flesh charred on the tip. Similar brown liquid spot left a trail on the cold, cement basement floor deep into the darker recesses. Diana walked toward the darkness, squinting to see what was in the back left corner of her moldy basement. Her eyes still adjusting, she saw the silhouette of jars on shelves. She could tell the jars were filled with the dark liquid. Two gelatinous orbs floated in the liquid, but she couldn't make them out clearly. She looked around for a light cord hanging from the ceiling and remembered that there was one in the center of the basement. She walked to her right and toward the center of the basement and yanked on the cord. A dangling freestanding light with no cover swung awkwardly in the basement. The light flailing around recklessly, her eyes stung from the sudden burst, and she adjusted, looking to her left first in the jar corner. The liquid was blue and the orbs were. No, it couldn't be. She rubbed her eyes aggressively, leaving stars when she opened them back up. She walked closer, grabbing the first jar with shaking hands, looking terrified at the floating slabs of flesh that looked forcefully removed from woman's chests. There had to be almost 50 jars, all with similar size and shape breasts. No more. She didn't hear the truck rolling slowly down the long gravel road toward the house, or the squeaky brakes on the truck came to a halt just outside the window. Diane backed up, hyperventilating. Her mind was spinning. Her heart beat with an impressive thump. She turned to run and saw something at the opposite corner that made her stop. She walked toward the far right, the light still swinging back and forth, slowly teasing her with a partial visual and then burying what she was seeing in deep darkness. She reached up for the light and held in her shivering right hand, making a loud clanging noise as it smacked rapidly against her rings. Diana aimed the light at the far right corner, and there was a young woman nagged on the floor. Her body was bruised and battered. She shivered nearly dead. Her nose and eyes were wrapped tight with a thick cloth. The girl couldn't have been much older than Rebecca. Diana placed her hand over her mouth. Tears gushed from her eyes. She swore the girl was dead, but then her body flopped like a fish on her last breath out of the water. Diana squinted through the tears and saw the girl's lips were sealed closed with an adhesive and stitches. Diana nearly threw up bile filling her throat, then up to her mouth. She swallowed it down in an acadic gulp, her face contorted. Diana didn't hear the front door open or the sound of the footsteps in the kitchen. The loud throbbing in her ears drowned out the basement door being pulled open and the loud creaking of each step down into the basement. Through the sound of the rushing vomit in her throat, she didn't hear the slapping of the boots on the old concrete floor. Diana, unable to see any more of this, turned around only to find Frank standing there with a club in his right hand. His eyes were the darkest she had ever seen. The vein that ran from his eyebrow to temple pulsed like a fire hose to full tilt. He was breathing heavily through his nose. Diana's heart fell to her feet. Her stomach almost let all of her bowels go. She gulped and tried to scream, but the terror silenced her. She took one stumbling step back and crashed to the floor, landing on her elbow with a crack. She wailed in pain, never taking her eyes off of Frank. He was closing in methodically. He leaned over and grabbed her roughly by her blouse. A tiny rip could be heard from the force of his pull. He looked her into her eyes. Rage and hatred filled them both. Diana thought she was looking at the devil, his once handsome face taking on demonic qualities. He leaned in close, his nose nearly touching Diana, and in a low, throaty growl asked her, "Can you keep a secret?"